Wikileaks and American hypocrisy. For decades, news organizations in the U.S. have published government secrets without the American government coming after them. But can Wikileaks or its founder be pursued in American courts? And if it's true that Wikileaks is a threat to America, why is the U.S. administration turning a blind eye to the New York Times and other newspapers who are publishing information from Wikileaks every day? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Feliba Thibault. Welcome to the program. Ever since a 1971 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, news organizations have been immune from prosecution for publishing classified information, no matter how it was obtained. But since Wikileaks started releasing embarrassing U.S. government cables last month, the Obama administration has attempted to distinguish the whistleblowing website from traditional media organizations. Yet, with Senator Joe Lieberman suggesting the New York Times should possibly face prosecution for publishing some of the materials, questions about prosecuting Wikileaks started to emerge inside and outside the U.S. with a fresh wave of accusations of censorship from many around the world, including Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, who accused the U.S. of undemocratic behavior. Emeka Omolu has more.
Two legal battles on both sides of the Atlantic. Julian Assange's lawyers are convinced that's what's coming their way, and here's why. 250,000
classified documents from someone inside the government to someone outside the government is a crime.
The United States strongly condemns the illegal disclosure of classified information.
U.S. officials making no secret of their intent to pursue Wikileaks for releasing classified U.S. cables. They're looking at various criminal charges, including espionage. But the U.S. has tried this before and failed, and in a similar case. 1971. Volumes of top-secret files about why and how America went to war in Vietnam are unearthed by the New York Times. They're called the Pentagon Papers. The details explosive and embarrassing. Among other things, it shows the American military being much more involved than previously thought. It changes the course of the war and the public's support for it.
At this very moment, we're killing people in Vietnam.
The Nixon government tried to punish the New York Times using the Espionage Act. But in a landmark decision, Supreme Court judges overruled this, citing press freedom. That hasn't stopped the U.S. saying the Espionage Act is one of the options being looked at this time around.
People would be have a misimpression if the only statute you think that we are looking at is the Espionage Act. That is certainly something that might play a role, but there are other statutes, other tools that we have at our disposal.
Several newspapers, including the New York Times, are participating now in the Wikileaks expose. The question is, will the U.S. government come after them or not? Emeka Omolu for Inside Story.
Well, joining us to discuss this topic are our guests in Washington, D.C., Matthew Duss. He's the National Security Editor at the Center for American Progress. In New York City, Lou Clarivas. He's a professor at the NYU Center for Global Affairs and a regular writer on legal issues pertaining to national security. And in London, Ian Black, he's the Middle East editor of the Guardian newspaper. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. If I could start with you, Lou Clarivas in New York. Now, the release of these diplomatic cables was done in conjunction with a select group of news organizations, including the Guardian, Germany's Der Spiegel, and the New York Times. If the information published puts U.S. national security at risk, as the American government claims, why are they only seeking action against Wikileaks and Julian Assange? Why are they not going after the big guns like the New York Times?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that there's degrees of culpability. Obviously, the most culpable party here, the party that's most guilty, is whoever leaked the documents initially. A next level of culpability would be WikiLeaks, and then a little bit further on would be the established news media, such as the New York Times or Washington Post. I wouldn't rule out a prosecution against the media. I don't know if it's a politically prudent move, but there certainly have been people.
But is it likely? Is it likely that the Obama
administration?
Is it likely that the Obama administration would go after a giant like the New York Times?
Well, again, I think it's a political judgment. If you ask me to make a bet in Vegas, I would say probably not. but I wouldn't rule it out either.
All right. Well, let me bring in Matthew Duss. Now, President Obama, Matthew, has been calling for more transparency in government ever since he was inaugurated, most likely perhaps because of his predecessor, George W. Bush, who wasn't exactly a poster child for transparency. I'm thinking here, of course, of the so-called weapons of mass destruction that were never found in Iraq. Why is it, do you think, that the Obama administration is making such a big fuss about these revelations when, you know, some of the information released isn't even that earth-shattering?
Right. I mean, first of all, any government is going to be nervous and concerned about this sort of disclosure. I think, you know, I don't think it's very controversial to say that, you know, the effective practice of foreign policy requires some element of confidentiality and expectation of secrecy. So I think they, in the first instance, they're just really kind of trying to protect their prerogatives here. You know, to just sound a warning that they are very, very concerned about this, even though some of these things are far less, you know, they're far less damaging than we might have thought at the beginning. So I think they really are just trying to put down a marker here. I don't see any, I think it's very unlikely that they will actually bring any kind of legal action against the media.
So if they're going after Assange, is it really because they're worried, as you say, they're not really worried about the content of what was published, but rather perhaps to minimize the potential domestic fallout?
Right. I wouldn't say they're not worried. I think they clearly are. But in general, I think they are, as I said, just trying to put down a marker here and protect their own prerogatives and their own secrecy. But, you know, I don't doubt that they are looking very assiduously into different possibilities for going after Assange and going after WikiLeaks. But as yet, I haven't really seen any kind of plausible legal argument under which they could hope to prosecute him.
All right, let's bring in Ian Black, who's the Middle East editor for The Guardian newspaper in London. Thank you again for being with us, Ian. Now, The Guardian was one of the papers that published these revelations from WikiLeaks. Tell us first, how were you given access to these documents, and what sort of collaboration did WikiLeaks and The Guardian have?
Well, I think that the story is now fairly well known. The WikiLeaks acquired the documents. They were shared with us and our 4 other media partners who were involved in this enterprise of reporting and analyzing the material. And we worked together in terms of identifying, prioritizing stories. We worked together on a process in parallel of editing, redacting the published material to avoid any kind of damage as best we could to individuals.
But were you ever concerned, sorry to interrupt you, but were you ever concerned at any point about the legal implications of publishing these documents? I mean, were you worried that the US government could perhaps come after The Guardian?
Well, we obviously looked at the legal implications very carefully before deciding to go ahead, and we were satisfied that it was perfectly safe from our point of view to do so. I think, as one of the other guests said, I think it's important in this to remember who did what, how the leak originated. Allegations made against a member of the US Armed Forces, WikiLeaks being apparently in receipt of the material, and then the role of the media. So there are stages of involvement, and obviously The Guardian, like the other partners, I'm sure, looked very carefully at the implications of what it was doing, bearing in mind all the while that we saw this as a legitimate journalistic enterprise, absolutely in the public interest.
But you say there's stages of involvement, but it seems that, you know, this global witch hunt is only being directed towards Julian Assange. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Well, I wouldn't agree, because, as we know, charges have been brought against a serviceman who is alleged to have leaked material in the first place.
Right, but what about the media organizations?
Sorry, in the sense that...
In the sense that, you know, we're not, you know, they're not really pointing the finger at the New York Times or The Guardian for publishing these informations.
But I mean, it seems to me that your question needs to be directed not at the media, those media organizations, but at the US administration, where, and we're hearing, you know, various noises from Senator Lieberman in particular. There's been some very extravagant, very colorful language being used. The Guardian, we have explained our position and justified it. I'm not sure that there's anything else that we would want to say on that subject. We've explained why we did what we did, the public interest, our ability as a media organization with the resources, the ability to report, to contextualize, to analyze this extraordinary cache, unprecedented amount of information that has given us a unique insight into the foreign policy of the most powerful country on earth. That's what we've done. Anybody else, they must clearly speak for themselves.
Right. Well, you mentioned an interesting point there. You mentioned Senator Joe Lieberman, and we've heard Joe Lieberman say that the New York Times should possibly face prosecution for publishing these diplomatic cables. Luke Lavier is in New York. Let me ask you, is there any legal rationale that could make the U.S. government go after the New York Times or Julian Assange?
Sure there is. In fact, there have been 3 legal precedents where in passing the courts have ruled that it would be perhaps acceptable to go after established media for publishing national security secrets, and that they would not be able, especially in a time of war, to use the First Amendment, which gives them freedom of press, to use the First Amendment as a shield. They would not be given a constitutional shield.
Could the Espionage Act be applied in this circumstance, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. In the past, in the previous administration under George W. Bush, his Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, in fact, said that he had read the Espionage Act, and the way he interpreted it was that it would allow prosecution of the media should they publish national security information.
Well, Matthew does. We've seen civil liberties in the United States somewhat be curtailed under the so-called war on terror. Is the First Amendment, in your opinion, is the freedom of speech also being abused because of the war on terror?
I don't know if I would say it's being abused. I mean, clearly we live in a very new media environment right now, where a private in the U.S. military can transmit reams and reams of data to an organization like WikiLeaks, and then it ends up on the front pages of the world's major newspapers. In terms of applying the Espionage Act to either WikiLeaks or even to the New York Times, again, I think you can make an argument that as the statute as written would apply, but I think the way it has been interpreted thus far, especially as I see the controlling case here being the Pentagon Papers, it's generally understood that the First Amendment does protect, and so I think it really comes down to a political question. Is the Obama administration interested at this point, given everything else that's going on, giving everything else it has on its plate, willing to get into this fight right now and see the world's media organizations probably rise up against it?
It's certainly surprising to see the reaction in the United States. I mean, American people are very adamant about freedom of expression, more so than anywhere else in the world. You would think that releasing this information would be in the public's best interest.
Well, I agree. I mean, I don't completely agree. I think I think there is reason to be concerned by the government here. Some of this information clearly is valuable and clearly does shed valuable light on the practice of U.S. foreign policy, but I haven't seen myself any outpouring of public anger, certainly that would indicate public support for going after the New York Times. I think Joe Lieberman is kind of just doing what Joe Lieberman does, which is looking for any opportunity to grandstand. All
right. Ian Black, now you've been reading all these revelations, this information disclosed by WikiLeaks. The quantity, some would say, is impressive, but the quality not necessarily. I mean, some of the information in there we already knew, such as the Afghan corruption being rampant in the Afghan government, or that Obama doesn't care about Europe. Some of this information doesn't really come as a surprise. Now, my question is, the United States is saying that this could be a threat to U.S. national security. Is there any information that could be really damaging to U.S. national security? How much damage can these revelations cause, really?
Well, I think that there's been very little that's come out in the from the WikiLeaks documents so far that is truly damaging. I think that it's important to make a distinction between damage and embarrassment. I think it is embarrassing for the US government to have such a vast, wholesale, global exposure of the way it does business. Everybody, all human beings are interested in the difference between what people say in private and how they put it in public.
Tell us about your cooperation with the other media organizations, with the New York Times, for instance. What did The Guardian give the New York Times? What information?
Well, the information that we had, the whole cache has been shared by the five partners. We've operated together. We have, as I said earlier, we have identified, we've looked for, we've identified stories. We've agreed a rough schedule of publication so that we haven't been competing with each other. From the way this began on November the 29th, all the partners ran stories about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and Iran. The next day we all ran stories about the Chinese position on North Korea and so on. So there's been a pretty close coordination of the major stories. There's been
It's certainly very interesting to see, competitive news organizations work so closely together.
Well, it is an unusual thing, but this is nothing if not an unusual story. We've never seen anything like this before. It presented particular problems. We're discussing one aspect of them now, the legal aspect of it, but there are problems of logistics, indeed of trying to remove from it an element of competition that would have been natural in other circumstances, but would have been completely disruptive and indeed paralyzing had it not been dealt with. We've all published stories that are of national interest. The Guardian today has stories about Northern Ireland, which I don't imagine have been picked up in Spain or in France, or possibly not even in the US. In Germany, there's been a particular emphasis on matters German, and so on and so forth. But in the broad lines of the big global stories, we collaborated because this was a remarkable and really fairly smooth collaborative enterprise dealing with a unique event, the availability of this vast cache of information. It was hard to imagine that any one news organization could have done it by itself. We needed to do it together for a variety of reasons, and with the odd problem, it's been pretty successful so far.
All right, Luke Lavera, let's talk about the legal aspect once more. You mentioned Senator Joe Lieberman, and he, along with some of his colleagues, are keen on introducing, I understand, a bill dubbed the SHIELD Act that would make disclosing the names of confidential military or intelligence informants illegal. It almost seems like the U.S. government is trying to silence people by making up new laws.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far to say that. And I have to admit, I'm unfamiliar with the pending legislation that Joe Lieberman has proposed in Congress. But I do know that he has been a vocal proponent of the Department of Justice taking a more spearheaded effort here, definitely going after Assange in his view, and keeping an open mind about going after the media.
Matthew, what are your thoughts on that? And if you could also talk to us perhaps about the relationship between the media and the White House in the United States. I mean, how close is it? In some European countries, there's been criticism of the media being too close, perhaps, of the governments. When we hear about journalists of the New York Times going to the White House before releasing these latest WikiLeaks revelations, of course, a lot of questions come to mind. So how exactly is the relationship between the media and the White House today?
Well, first, quickly, just on the legislation that Senator Lieberman is proposing, the SHIELD law, which would apply to the release of classified names of classified operatives. So this would, going forward, as I read it, would really only apply to the release of those names. So if those names are redacted, I'm not sure how it would apply. Now, going to the relationship between the media and the White House, I think the fact that certain media organizations did work within some parameters with the White House, with the administration, in redacting some of these documents, I think does go to show that the New York Times, while it is in the business of news and in breaking news, it still recognizes that there is a balance here between showing the public, releasing news to the public that benefits the public and protecting American national security. So they're not just going out there willy-nilly and publishing this stuff. They actually do care about the ways in which U.S. national security could be compromised. So they're recognizing recognize that there has to be a balance here. I think the relationship between certain journalists is much closer than others. I know one friend of mine who works in the Pentagon has said that he personally has, for the moment, will not be talking to journalists about anything. So I think this is probably something that we'll see, you know, at a person-to-person level. Certain sources are probably a bit angry with the New York Times right now, and so I think these different journalists will deal with these problems with their sources as they come up.
Ian Black in London, did The Guardian experience any sort of pressure, political pressure, in publishing these revelations?
I would say that we've had lots of people very interested to find out in advance what we're going to be doing, particularly after the exercise began. Plenty of journalists, myself included, have received calls from contacts in government, fishing for information, trying to find out what was coming next. But beyond that, I don't think that we have been subject to what you would call political pressure. As I say, we've been fairly confident of our position, both legally and journalistically. The material was out there, and we felt that we were doing, first and foremost, a journalistic service. We were doing our jobs by explaining it and sharing that with our readers.
All right. Well, you talk about doing your journalistic job, but there certainly have been a lot of questions about the values of traditional journalistic approach. Journalists didn't get this information out. It was Wikileaks that got this information out. They didn't dig out this information. Is that disappointing at all to you? And what does this say about the future of mainstream journalism, traditional journalism?
Well, I don't know whether it's disappointing. The material was there. I think we all agree that this is without precedent. Never before has there been such a vast cache of secret or confidential documents been out there for journalists to look at. We've looked at the material. We've analysed it. We've contextualised it. We've tried to explain it. I don't know what else we could have done. Taken that the material was there, we treated it with all the, the objectivity and the caution and the care that we would apply to any story at all. It's true that we acquired the information in exceptional circumstances. What does that say about the future of journalism? I think, first of all, it says that this has been a very, very unusual, if not unique, event, and that we carry on practicing journalism at a time of enormous change as best we can. I mean, an important part of the whole WikiLeaks saga has been about the technology that has made its distribution instantly and globally available. But the fundamental job of reporting, I think that we have all shown that is still necessary and indeed an indispensable part of the media at a time of enormous change. We've used traditional skills to analyse something that we acquired in an extraordinary way.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. We are going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, for now. Thank you all. In Washington, D.C., Matthew Duss. In New York, Luke Larivas. And in London, Ian Black. Thank you all for taking part in this discussion. And thank you as well for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. Of course, as always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.